everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore, and today we have a really interesting guest. I'm happy she agreed to come on. It's a long time coming because I'm a big fan of history, and I think it's important for us to understand where psychedelics came from, and it might help us shape where we want them to go. So here's a little bit of a background on Erika Dyck, Ph.D. and historian, kind of medical historian. And so Erika Dyck grew up in Saskatoon and started a BA in history at the University of Saskatchewan before transferring to Dalhousie, probably murdered that word, to complete her degree in history. She returned to Saskatchewan and completed a master's with Valerie Korenick in 2000. After a year working at a law firm in Toronto, she began her Ph.D. in history of medicine at McMaster University. Her dissertation has now been published as a book titled Psychedelic Psychiatry, LSD from Clinic to Campus, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2008 and republished by the University of Manitoba Press in 2011. Her 2013 book, Facing Eugenics, was shortlisted for the Canada Prize in Social Sciences for the John A. Macdonald Prize from 2005 to 2008. Erika was the co-director of the History of Medicine program at the University of Alberta, where she was cross-appointed to the Departments of History and Classics and the Faculty of Medicine and Dentistry. In Alberta, she taught history courses for medical students as well as history of medicine courses for undergraduate and graduate students in the Faculty of Arts, with particular emphasis on the history of psychiatry and mental health. At the University of Saskatchewan, Erika teaches courses in the history of medicine, madness, and methodology. She is particularly interested in making history inclusive and learning about people who have been written about but rarely listened to. Some of the community-engaging collaborations have created spaces for these discussions. See historyofmadness.ca and eugenicsarchive.ca. Erika also serves as the co-editor of the Canadian Bulletin for Medical History / Bulletin Canadien de Histoire de la Médecine with Kenton Croker. My French is non-existent, so sorry about that. In 2014, Erika was nominated the New College of Scholars, Artists, and Scientists at the Royal Society of Canada and was inducted later that year. So it's really great to have Erika on the show. I've known about her work for a while, and I think I listened to a bunch of podcasts way back, and I was like, oh, this person really has it dialed. And so I hope you enjoy this episode. It's fun. I probably could have dug into Canadian psychedelic psychiatric history for, at least 5 more hours. So I hope we can have Eric on again in the future. Yeah, and I guess that's it for the intro. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Before we dig in, I want you to know that we have launched sales for Navigating Psychedelics for clinicians and therapists. The classes will start up in the live supported version in January. So if you want to check us out, psychedeliceducationcenter.com to learn more, or you can psychedelicstoday.com and you'll find some links there as well. It is a great way to get a foundation for this weird, wacky world of psychedelics. This is not a how to trip sit, how to facilitate sessions. We cover a lot of that, but this is not something that's kind of like a complete guide for that. We're of the opinion that's more of like a 2-year program. And this is not a easy skill to learn. So our intention is to give you a foundation of transpersonal psychology, Stan Groff's work, and just kind of harm reduction overall. And we have included with that class a ton of master classes, I think 12 maybe 14 even, where we talk to experts in different sub areas of the field, and they kind of give their kind of insight on those particular sub areas. And a recent addition was a friend of mine who has worked at probably more legal psychedelic retreats than anybody else. And that one was just added up there. I'm not going to say who the name is here, but you can see that person if you buy the class. And it's really an interesting take. There's a lot of criticisms of what's happening in the world, and there's also a lot of praise for what's happening out there as well. So I tend to think this is the best introduction you can take. And if you want to jump in and start approaching the field, come join us. We've got about 50 seats total between two different segments. We've got a time that's appropriate for folks in London and the US East Coast, and folks from Australia regularly join as well. I think they take our later class because it's not 3 a.m. for them. It's more like 6 or 7. So if you're in Australia and you want to join us, please do. Yeah, we've had folks from all over the world now. So like Russia, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Switzerland, all over regular Europe, regular Europe, as if that's a thing. Canadians, Mexicans, we have folks from South America too. It's really, really awesome how international we've been getting. I think we even had some folks from South Africa, maybe. Yeah. So it's been really fun, really engaging for me and Kyle. And just really excited for this thing to kick up in January. So to learn more, again, psychedeliceducationcenter.com. Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists, the live edition, 8 weeks of live supported classes, plus all of our pre-recorded content. So hope to see you there, and really excited. So with all that, on with the episode. Erika Dyck, Ph.D. Enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Professor of History at the University of Saskatchewan, Erika Dyck, Ph.D. Thanks for joining us, Erika.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I am super excited to dig in here. You've been studying the history of psychedelics, including some really important epochs of psychedelic history, like the stuff happening in Saskatchewan, which is really substantial, and some of the work with Humphry Osmand and Huxley, while those guys were trying to sort out the term psychedelic, and much more. Cool. So how did you get into this topic? Did it just kind of like seem like this interesting area that was under-researched in history? Or is there something else that happened?
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting, I think it's an interesting story, and maybe one that you wouldn't expect. I was particularly interested in different parts of Canadian history, and I was interested in what happened in Saskatchewan. You may know, or your listeners may know, that Saskatchewan was the first jurisdiction in North America to elect a socialist government. Lots of people have argued that this government wasn't, in fact, socialist in the end, but at least they called themselves that. And so there was a lot of international attention on what was going on in 1944. There were things going on in the Cold War at this time already. And what I was really curious about was, what kind of research does a government like that invest in when the government was elected on a platform of supporting a publicly funded healthcare system? For Canadians, this became the sort of blueprint for what became known as Medicare, or our pride and joy in Canada, at least, our publicly funded universal healthcare system. And so that maybe sounds a little bit strange that that's what led me to psychedelics, but it was clear that from early days of support from the government, they started reaching out to a variety of different research units and advertising internationally for people with rather bold ideas and willing to invest in a kind of political experiment at the same time that they're investing in different kinds of healthcare and public policy experiments. And this is where Humphry Osmand came to Saskatchewan. He came in 1951, and he was, I don't know that his wife ever forgave him. Jane was not excited about the long, cold winters. But Osmond was really excited for the opportunity to invest in a kind of research that he felt was stifled in where he was working in London prior to this, that there wasn't a lot of energy or interest in looking at things that kind of looked outside the box. And so he ended up in Saskatchewan investing in this with the support of the local government.
Well, that's super cool, and really an interesting angle. Are you initially from Saskatchewan?
I grew up in Saskatchewan, and I'm slightly embarrassed to admit that I spent most of my life trying to plot my escape. And I went to Ontario for my PhD, where I started that in 2001 and started investing in this kind of research. And of course, it was then what led me back to, I spent my summers in Saskatchewan combing through archives when I hadn't realized that this was sort of in my own backyard.
Well, that's really interesting. But it makes a lot of sense, right? Like people want to leave the places where it feels slow. But there is still some really interesting history in these places.
Yeah, in some ways, I think it's perhaps the slowness or the expectation that exciting things weren't happening here, or that innovative or significant things weren't happening, that allowed them to sustain the research that they did for as long as they did.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess for a little bit of context, like what I know about the use in Saskatchewan is there's a lot of research happening, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but LSD being a leading treatment for alcohol use disorder, alcohol addiction for a good period of time in Saskatchewan. But were
Yeah.
there other indications being treated as well?
Well, it's a tricky thing because, if we use today's diagnostics and statistics manual, the DSM, to go back, we might, widen that group. But I think at the time, they were only dealing with the first DSM at that moment, and it was a much slimmer edition. So the kinds of indications that they had seem a little bit off.
Yeah.
Just the terminology and the language used to describe it was a bit different. There's also some interesting things, I think, I guess, for Osmond and his team and his collaborators, people like Abe Hoffer, who was a psychiatrist in Saskatoon, or Duncan Blewett, who was a psychologist rather in Regina. Anyway, there were a group of them who were all sort of investing in thinking through the possible values of psychedelics or the applications of them. And one of the first hypotheses they had, which ended up getting a little bit discarded, but I think there's still some value in thinking about it, is the role of, in their case, LSD or mescaline as a psychomimetic. And the logic here was that by giving staff working in major mental hospitals, which was, a lot of people with mental disorders were living in mental hospitals at this time, by giving staff, social workers, psych nurses, psychiatrists, even administrators and the odd cabinet minister were exposed to LSD experiences to try to empathize with the plight of their patients. And we know that it's not really a true psychomimetic, and there's been lots of literature since to suggest that this was a false premise. But I think the psychology behind it, rather than the sort of neuroscience behind it, is still rather interesting to imagine that you could allow staff to have an experience that would just alter their sense of reality enough that they might trust that a patient who also had challenges in their perception or disorders in their perception might be saying something worth listening to. And it wasn't that it would be the same, but that having that feeling or the experience of not knowing what to trust in your environment from what you see perhaps or how you hear was enough to try to create a bit of empathy with patients. And that was really rewarding, both for patients who felt that they had more sympathetic staff surrounding them, but also for the staff members who felt that, it allowed them to just think differently about how their patients were behaving. And a good example was that, an architect took LSD under Osmond's supervision to make some recommendations for how to change the hospital environment. And what he found was that actually tiled floors that had sort of a checkerboard arrangement were really frightening for people who were having hallucinations or even having depth perception challenges due to some kind of psychosis. He was not a doctor, so he wasn't concerned so much about the specifics, but he said, when I look at these, I think they look like holes in the floor, and I would stay in my bed too. So it's not that someone maybe doesn't want to engage in the group activity, but that they didn't want to get out of bed because they thought they would fall into a hole. So it's sort of insights like that I think are really quite fascinating and quite interesting that they were allowed to invest in this in a rigorous way. And quite quickly after exploring the psychomimetic.
Making me think of Temple Grandin.
Yeah, totally. They started looking into alcoholism. And alcoholism wasn't even really, there wasn't clear consensus that it was a medical disorder even at this time. So they were also kind of fighting that battle a little bit at the same time. And it ended up meaning that they brought together a rather unorthodox group of people to investigate alcohol abuse or alcohol problem drinking, as they called it even.
Right. That's interesting. Huh. So were they able to do you have a sense of how many people might have consumed LSD or mescaline in a clinical setting in Saskatchewan, during that early period?
Yeah, it's a good question. when I started doing this research in 2001, 2002, I wasn't granted access to the clinical files at the time. And since then, we've been able to get access, but then the archives have been closed for COVID. So I can't say with any real confidence that I have clear numbers. But what I can guess at is there were sort of two different styles of this research. And it's tricky. I'm stumbling over my language here because some of it we might think of in hindsight as a bit more recreational, that was done in people's living rooms or in their kitchens. And some of the staff encounters weren't recorded as clinical trials because these were experiences to give someone a training. So if we include those numbers, it becomes even harder to track down because those weren't all recorded or they didn't keep track in the same ways. When it comes to the clinical trials, and again, the trials here are not really done in a randomized controlled environment. They're done in a different way. Some of the people who came through the alcohol system were definitely clearly recorded. They were definitely asked to respond. They had 2-year follow-ups, and in some cases, much longer than that. And we have hundreds of cases of those examples. And much of that material was also published. So not, every person's anecdotal experience, but the results, the follow-up, the protocols, all of that material has been published and suggests that there were hundreds of people who came through those trials. But there are a few outliers. So people who might have been high profile, but had gotten in trouble with the law for their drinking, say, and driving, or drinking, say, and fighting, who may have been in a criminal situation. Some of those people had requested more clandestine. So those files were not necessarily put in the same place. So I would suspect that there may only be a handful or so of those, but we know that we can't get a really solid number. We can't be really confident in the numbers because there was stigma at the time about drinking and driving, for example, or drinking and being put in jail, and then stigma afterwards about the use of psychedelics more broadly that led people to not want to sign off on me or anyone else taking a look at those files. And that conversation is changing now, such that we're being able to access some of those files now as the stigma around psychedelics is changing. And so I suspect that actually the psychedelic renaissance might actually allow for historical research to become a little bit more precise.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. One of the advantages Groff had in doing a lot of his work was not only did he have, piles of his own clinical data to look through, but he also, from what I understand, had access to everybody's birth records. So he's able to do this kind of comparative analysis that wasn't really possible in many other countries. So he had like the stories around being choked by umbilical cords, different kinds of births, all that. And it would just be a really helpful thing if historians had better access, I think.
Yeah, there's another clinic that I've been studying, which is a private clinic in British Columbia. It no longer exists, but it was called Hollywood Hospital, not to be confused with Hollywood in California. But the sort of stories and there's some pretty salacious stories that you can find in tabloids about this place that, wealthy film stars were flown in secret and were treated for all sorts of addictions, mostly alcohol, or at least that was what was described at the time. I can't say that I have found the salacious stories that I had hoped to find. I can't prove that Cary Grant was there, for example, despite newspaper clips claiming that he was, which might be because I don't have the full set of records. It's unclear. But what's interesting is kind of like Groff's approach, not so much around birth, which was clearly one of Groff's interests, but what happened in those records is, for most of them, what we have is a prompted autobiography. So each person who was selected to go through this trial, some were mandated, so they were sent there for treatment. Others paid to have an experience. And so you've got volunteers, a mix of volunteers and patients. But they were asked to write out their autobiographies ahead of time. And they were prompted by about 12. Oh. So you've got this, they're not as interested in, I would say, not sort of Groff questions. So not questions about, the circumstances of one's birth, but certainly the circumstances of one's life. And you definitely see, these cases span from 1957 to 1974. There are people who have lived through the Holocaust, who talk about being detained in camps. They talk about Japanese internees during the Second World War. Certainly, there are people who identify with a kind of trauma that I think we would all recognize. And, for some, there have been international investigations, and others are more subtle. Someone living in a dysfunctional family, for example, where it's a little bit more anecdotal or specific. But there's a lot of this conversation about why do you think that you might benefit from psychedelic therapy? And so it's people reflecting on their own reasons for being there. Then you've got a couple of other pieces in these files where you've got an observer remarking on what's happening. So, patient sips coffee at 10 a.m., they indicate the doses, sort of as if someone was sitting in the room as a fly on the wall describing what's happening, but not engaging with the process. And then the following day, people who went through this experience, again, whether patients or volunteers, would write up about their experiences on their own. And often they reflect on that autobiography. And I think it's partly because, a few days prior to this, they probably sat down. Most of them hand wrote their biographies. And so in sort of reflecting on their experience, many of them tie that to things that they thought about as they reflected on their lives. And so we've got a really interesting set of materials to work with as people sort of try to make sense of their lives or try to confront the traumas that they've experienced, which many describe as holding them back in other aspects of their life.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I guess that's one of the cool things about psychedelic history that maybe people don't totally get is all these different things, while not, randomly controlled trials, like this is still a substantial amount of data that could be helpful, at least in steering the direction of future research and potentially impacting current research already. Like there's so many interesting findings in the archives.
And I'm not sure if you've experienced this in your own research, but I found that when I first started doing this research in the early 2000s, maybe I was looking in the wrong places or maybe I wasn't connected with the right groups. But I found, like, for example, in my graduate studies work, this was sort of a niche thing. This wasn't something that people were talking about. I think some people maybe thought what I was doing was a bit wild or crazy even, that this was a little anecdote in the history of psychiatry, but this wasn't something really that had profound significance going forward. And that attitude has changed tremendously over the past 20 years. And it's very interesting to hear how the conversation has changed and what that means for the ways that we can now interrogate the sources, but also the willingness for people to talk about their past experiences has really dramatically changed.
Right. Yeah, that's super interesting. And I'm not sure I've run into it directly.
I was so fortunate, and I didn't even appreciate how fortunate I was at the time. But in interviewing both patients and researchers from the 1950s, and most or all of the people who I interviewed were in their 80s or 90s, and they've all died since I started that research.
Oh, wow.
And so I do feel very, very fortunate to have connected with them. But also it's very interesting that even people like Humphry Osmand or Abram Hoffer, who were on the front lines of that psychedelic heyday in the 1950s, they were quite careful. And obviously they were sort of practiced at this, but they were quite careful about how I might characterize their work with psychedelics. And they insisted that, what they were doing was not unethical. They did not have money from the CIA. They had gone through checks and balances, and they were clearly responding to that very sort of heavy reputation and characterization of psychedelics. And I reflect on that every once in a while and wonder, what would they say today if they could see what was going on today? I wonder how that story would change a little bit.
Yeah, that would have been really interesting, right? To have those folks as early kind of evangelists, I guess, for the research. That would have been really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to me because I also met Timothy Leary, but I was not doing this research at the time, and it was perhaps a squandered opportunity. Now I think back on that in hindsight, but these were very different characters. And I think that's something to remember about the history of the psychedelic movement, that much like today, there are all sorts of personalities and different agendas at work. And I think if anything, one of the take-home messages from many of the people I spoke with in the past was a note of caution of, not letting the cat out of the bag before we're ready kind of thing. Now I'm sort of thinking ahead because I don't think they saw a psychedelic renaissance on the horizon. Although Abe Hoffer said to me in his office, he was still working into his 90s, and he said, "Mark my words, this will come back. It's too valuable." And I'm paraphrasing there. I don't remember the exact quote, but he's right. And it's quite interesting to see that they very much defended what they saw as a kind of value for psychedelics that they feel is being missed or has been missed by contemporary psychiatric interventions, mostly, kind of big pharma style psychopharmacology that misses really important elements of mental health treatments and what patients actually need, as opposed to what healthcare systems might prefer.
Right. And Abe Hoffer, he's an interesting character. He came up with this adrenochrome hypothesis for schizoaffective disorders. And he was involved in Saskatchewan's research?
Very much so. Yes, he and Osmond, they wrote letters every day. It was more expensive to talk on the phone then. And of course, this is before the digital age. So they wrote letters daily, sometimes multiple times a day, to keep track of different kind of research they were doing. They co-published on a lot of different projects. And it's true, Abe Hoffer, he and Osmond both started with psychedelics. And he was very, very, so Abe Hoffer had a background in biochemistry, and he was particularly interested in how, in sort of a, like to put it sort of colloquially, the notion that LSD or mescaline could cause what appeared to be a psychosis, or this is their model psychosis idea. He was very interested in then sort of taking that premise and turning it inside out. So if some kind of chemical can cause this disorder, then the disorder should therefore be some kind of chemical disorder. And so what can we learn about, antidotes to that? And he became incredibly invested in megavitamin therapies, niacin therapies, and this all stems from his adrenochrome theories in the first place. And I should say, to this day, there are groups, certainly across Canada, and I know there are some in the United States as well, that have still sort of formed around these megavitamin ideas. And much of it is also very much a kind of patient advocacy and patient activism groups. So people who felt that this allowed, this other way of thinking about schizophrenia allowed for more patient control. And that was really critical, both to Osmond and Hoffer. And you can kind of see it in their work that they see psychedelics in part as a means to an end. That is a means for understanding each other and for opening up the way we think about human consciousness, and perhaps even, like, I don't know if this is the right word to use, but to sort of normalize those responses so we don't just see human behavior as sick or well, but to try to think about a different kind of full range of spectrums of ways that people behave and think. And it's quite empowering. I mean, these are 1950s guys who wear white coats, and, Osmond had a pretty high-class British accent, but, they do kind of sound a little bit like countercultural heroes in some respects, when they really are advocates for patients' rights and patients' autonomy and challenging the status quo in their way.
Yeah. Interesting about the adrenochrome thing. Like, in pop culture, that gets a little mixed up with mescaline sometimes, I think on account of Hunter Thompson's work a little bit. But adrenochrome, doesn't, what was it? I think it was like an oxidized version of adrenaline or something like that. Not really available, or there's no real known use cases other than hypotheses from what I understand. Do you know anything about it specifically?
I don't really. I know that, Abe Hoffer wrote quite a bit about it, and he's reflected on it in his biography, his autobiography called My Life and Adventures in Psychiatry. And it's true. I don't quite understand. And you're right that it's an oxidized version of mescaline. In fact, there are some of the critical commentary at the time suggested that this was actually a mistake, that they had, miscalculated what was happening to these chemicals, and that it was only, or it was merely an oxidized version. And so there's a bit of back and forth there. And to be quite honest, I don't understand the biochemistry in any sophisticated way to really follow the logic of it. But I know there have been things written about from a psychopharmacological perspective that suggest that, there were also a lot of politics at play here, and that perhaps this idea was thrown out too quickly. And I'm not sure whether this idea is specific to the adrenochrome theory or some of the work that Hoffer was doing more broadly with megavitamins and niacin therapy, which he also was really keen on. And I think that developed out of his adrenochrome theories. So there's a whole other line of reasoning and science there that I haven't followed up on, and I think is a really fascinating area for someone with more knowledge in this area.
Right. It's interesting, right? Like the history of this stuff is accessible to a degree, and then it gets really complicated. So you kind of need like a niche, like a historian of chemistry or something.
Totally.
Instead of like a historian of medicine or science, generally.
And I will admit that there are about 200 boxes of archival materials in the Hoffer collection. And much of them, many of these boxes pertain to issues around adrenochrome and niacin. And but when I found the material on psychedelics, I did focus on those.
Right. It's kind of perhaps a lot more interesting and tangible in that, like, these things are kind of recreatable, at least.
Yeah.
Don't blame me there.
It was so interesting to see also the kind of attention that psychedelics were getting, whether it was people writing letters for access to supplies or really interested in the kinds of insights that they were developing. But Saskatchewan had this interesting moment where they were allowed to continue this research, and they had support to do this research for a sustained period of time without a lot of sort of negative oversight, I would say. They had that kind of core support from the government, who felt that things like a single session or a single dose therapy for alcoholism would be a really economically viable treatment to invest in for a government that's interested in creating a publicly funded healthcare system. So there's these interesting sort of political economy investments that I found really, really interesting when thinking about, why was this taking place in Saskatchewan? Was anybody paying attention? And it's true that they were certainly publishing widely and people knew about their work, but they also had this kind of core support. And what both Hoffer and Osmond talk about is the kind of freedom for experimentation, or the kind of research freedom that they were allowed, which really meant a lot to them.
Absolutely. So before we kind of kicked this off, you mentioned that you had done a little bit of research recently in peyote use historically.
Yeah, and again, it stems through the work of Hoffer and Osmond, but they were invited to participate in a peyote ceremony in 1956. So again, still before the word psychedelic was coined. It was first published in 1957. And they were invited by a group from the Native American Church in Canada that had just recently been approved to be recognized as a chapter of the Native American Church. And a group of people came together in Saskatchewan. They came from Montana, North Dakota, Alberta, Saskatchewan. They may have been further afield from there, but those are the ones I know of for sure. And it's kind of an interesting moment because on the one hand, they were clearly demonstrating to the Canadian federal government that what they were doing was part of a sacred ritual that should be allowed on the grounds of, Indigenous worship and Indigenous practice. So it's a cultural right on the one hand. And on the other hand, of course, this is bound up in the conversations around psychedelics. Peyote cactus, of course, has mescaline in it, or MDMA. And it's very interesting to see this kind of clash of different campaigns going on at once. So on the one hand, protecting Indigenous rights, which the federal government was in trouble about, shall we say. And on the other hand, it was the question of whether or not these chemicals and these rituals using chemicals should be allowed more broadly. And I think the federal government in Canada was thinking that, again, this white-coated British guy would walk in and behave like the colonialist that they expected him to be, and come out and say, these are rotten ceremonies. But that was absolutely not who Humphry Osmand was. He participated fully. He chewed the buttons, he threw up, he participated in the feast afterwards, he participated in the drumming circle. The three other scientists, white scientists as they were described in the news, they also attended, but they didn't participate. They didn't have peyote. And the thing was very much staged in the sense that everyone was dressed up and there were photographers taking pictures of this. So although it may have been an attempt to create an authentic representation, it was also a very staged event. But it means that we have all these wonderful photographs that are we have with permission from both groups now. Anyway, so Osmond then made a statement, and he's published about this in a variety of different places, saying this was an absolutely beautiful ceremony. It was absolutely sacred. It should be protected. It should be promoted. People should be given access to peyote so that they continue this sacred ceremony. And the Canadian government was not impressed with this reaction and sort of cut him off a little bit. But there are a number of people still in Saskatchewan who then launched a variety of different investigations, so legal investigations promoting, the protection of peyote. You may not be surprised by this, but peyote doesn't grow in Canada. And so the Canadian government kind of did an end run and said, well, fine, you can have the ceremonies, but you cannot import peyote.
Interesting. Yeah, it's like typical drug war logic.
Right. And it was a clash of cultural rights as much as it was about the psychedelics. I think in hindsight, it was clearly also a sort of anti-Indigenous move.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I think both in like Canada and the US, like we didn't really get a good, I can't even say it's good now, but we didn't really make progress, it seems like, until like the late 70s and into the late 80s on a lot of these Indigenous rights things. So kind of makes sense, I guess, from that perspective. Kind of curious, when these gentlemen like Osmond were checking out these ceremonies, do you know if like the NAC work looked a lot similar to how it does now?
It's a good question, and to be totally fair and honest, I don't know what the NAC work looks like now.
Okay.
I know that there was one chapter that was legally allowed to continue in Canada, and what I had heard was that it wasn't very active, but that also may not be the case today. I just don't know. And I know there's been a lot more activity south of here, like south of Canada, certainly in northern Mexico and in Texas and New Mexico and Oklahoma. That I know there were chapters there for sure that have had more attention, both from activists and scholars who've been looking at that. So I would go there to take a look first before I could say anything for sure.
Yeah, right. Have you had a chance to talk to Mike J about his recent history on mescaline?
Yeah, a little bit. We actually were on a panel together at Breaking Convention. I guess that was last year. Yeah, his book is really exciting, and I think it's a wonderful addition to the psychedelic history literature.
Yeah, that was I think that was my favorite book of 2018-19 whenever that came out. I was just like shocked at how comprehensive it was and engaging.
Absolutely.
Not too many history books have that.
Yeah, it's really well done.
Yeah. So what do you think is your, like, obviously you're teaching students, you're actively doing history. Like what do you kind of focus on specifically? Is it this kind of like Saskatchewan history or like Canadian psychedelic history?
Yeah, I would say that when I started the project in the early 2000s, I didn't know what I was getting into. And I ended up sort of focusing on the Saskatchewan studies, but also then trying to understand where they sat in the sort of psychedelic world. So the extent to which they were connected with other trials, the extent to which they were different from or the same as or championing certain ideas. And so it put at least in my head, I was sort of following these threads in other places. And as I mentioned, I think the conversation has changed quite a lot especially over the last 10 or 12 years. The book that I worked on came out in 2008. And since then, we've really seen an explosion. And I know that some of that is research that was already being done coming to the surface, but there's also just been like an exponential growth, as I'm sure you and your listeners well know. And so I think it's caused me to sort of reflect back, not just on the Saskatchewan materials, but on some of the conversations that were happening between units and within units to try to better appreciate the diversity of research that was taking place historically, and also to try to understand some of the challenges that led both to differences in outcomes in research at the time. So scientific debates or debates among scientific researchers about things like protocols or methods, but also the way that researchers responded to what happened by the end of the 1960s, which was, changing the nature of how research was being done. So how do you deal with the need to come up with regulations? Or, I think there was still quite a dramatic spectrum of responses. You have, I'll use Timothy Leary as an example.
Right.
Maybe he's not a good example. Maybe he's actually an outlier. But, you have some people who drop out of the sort of scientific world. He poo-poos the notion of working within the constraints of an academic environment and doesn't really conform to anything that looks like regulation and suggests that we should, spike Khrushchev's drinks with LSD to end the Cold War, and we should put it in the tap water in New York. And, there's these kind of stories. I don't know how many of them are actually true. But he becomes a real apostle of a very, very liberal agenda when it comes to psychedelics. And I think everyone is a bit cautious about following that path. That I don't hear that coming through right now. I don't hear champions emerging who are saying, like, we should just forget the COVID vaccine. What we need is just, LSD on tap. I don't think so. But by the same token, we also had people, who run all the way to the other end of the spectrum who were still engaged psychedelic researchers, but who were saying, we need really careful controls. And we need to really figure out who should have access to this and under what conditions. And I think we're still wrestling with some of those questions today. We have different language, perhaps, and some updated protocols and updated language to talk about disorders and methods. But I think we're really very much still at the point where we're trying to determine who should have access, under what conditions, who gets to call the shots. Is it commercialized? Is it monetized? Is it, medicalized? Do we get to grow our own? Should we only use plant-based medicines? And I think there's a really interesting conversation that is almost echoing some of the stuff that we've come to know historically.
Right. There's so many interesting questions there. Yeah. The Tim Leary thing, it's almost like he was the embodiment of LSD in a lot of ways. It's like, I need to expand, but science is so constraining. So let's shake it off. It's only constraining because it's slow. It's not as fast as, a mind on acid wants something to be. Who wants to wait 3 years to find out if it's okay to give somebody MDMA, or like 20 years, like Rick Doblin has probably been going for 30. It's like insane to me that this project has taken so long. So I get it, but it's also, how do we have that careful balance between slow, careful building of consensus data and then regulation as a result of that. Hopefully regulation is science-based, and not always the case.
And even if that becomes the case, even if we can imagine a world in which whichever, we can take all psychedelics, or you can choose your favorites or whatever.
Right.
They become sort of accepted medical treatments for probably specific conditions, and that there's some kind of language around this. Even if that becomes the case, what do our public health campaigns look like? How do we update our Just Say No campaigns? Maybe that's like too old historical, but how do we update the way we talk to high school students, or not high school students for that matter? How do we talk to people in harm reduction communities? I think there's a lot of sort of cultural catch up that will have to take place as well, even once we have relative consensus or we're satisfied with how we want to talk about psychedelics in a medicalized context. People will take them outside of that medical. We have opiates that we use in a medical context, and we know that there are massive problems with the way that opiates are taken outside of that medical context. And it creates a whole other set of conversations and debates and complications about how we talk about addiction, how we talk about pain relief. So I think we still have to catch up on, people will take them if they want to take them anyway.
Yeah.
And is that going to be something that we criminalize or sort of keep in the criminal domain? Or are we ready for a deeper conversation about harm reduction in our communities? And I know here we have, I'm in Saskatchewan, you're in Colorado. Both of our governments have had a lot to say about cannabis. Canada, boldly decriminalized cannabis. I'm not sure they knew exactly what they were getting into, but there's interesting conversations going on in the cannabis world that I think also suggests that maybe people want to have a different conversation about drugs in our society. And I will say drugs and make that as wide open. In my view, I think we need to talk about fentanyl and cannabis and opioids and psychedelics. And, people are taking these things on label and off label. And I think it seems that our modern world is interested in having these conversations, even though perhaps regulators aren't quite comfortable in moving the boxes around.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense or if I'm just on a
Absolutely.
soapbox.
No, absolutely. I agree. It's insane. Like, yes, people are always going to be using drugs. Carl Hart's made some amazing arguments about the impact of the war on drugs all over the world. Like there's countries where people will be executed with personal use amounts of drugs found on them. And it's insane to me that like the US and, just Western drug policy has made this happen in places like North Korea, Indonesia, Philippines, stuff like that. It's nuts to me.
And yet some of the same jurisdictions that have really, really, I was going to say high tolerance, low tolerance for personal use are also heavily invested in creating the ingredients that go into our pharmaceutical products.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got this real mishmash, I think, of, where profits overwhelm logic, in my view, in terms of, responsibility for regulating these things and criminalizing them. We know that, opiate production is really important for, I keep harping on opiates, but I think it's an easy target right now.
Right.
Opiate production is really important. And in some of the places that have the largest opiate production, these are the places that also have some of the highest penalties for personal use.
Yeah.
Our governments are addicted to the war on drugs.
Right. It's an amazing way to get votes.
Yeah.
Like, look at me, I'm hard on drugs and crime. When there's just like a huge amount of like, I think legacy drug war dollars spent to manipulate perception of the drug war. Like, we're still dealing with stuff that Nixon and some of his cronies like jammed down our throats. And hopefully we can outgrow that. Like I'm excited. Carl Hart's got a book coming out, I think January or February, like drug use for adults, talking about like, let's not moralize this stuff. Let's actually treat it like it's a normal social phenomenon that, other countries like Switzerland and Portugal have done really well with.
Yeah. What do you think about the palliative care conversation? Because I feel like this is a space where some of these arguments are losing their grip, and where, there are different kinds of, I guess, allies or champions of opening up the conversation when people are on their deathbed.
Well, this is one of the longest researched areas in psychedelic assisted psychiatry, I guess you want to call it that. Like, it was really easy to get permission to deal with dying people in psychedelic states, and your country just had a big win with Therasil giving at least 4 people compassionate access to psilocybin in their last days. I'm friendly with a palliative care doctor in Arizona, and it just it doesn't fit. It's like an additional thing. Like they've got their quiver of tools, like, counselors, social workers, priests, and, various traditional psychiatric interventions. But this is pretty radical, I guess, in terms of like what they've been dealing with for, the 80, I don't even know, how long has it been since the drug war started? Early 70s, like 72-ish, maybe, if I want to pin it there. Like, it's been that long. So like 50 years plus, I guess, of prohibition. So, of course their field doesn't have any data on it, but I think we need kind of like educators to go into those spaces and talk to those associations, because this would be really helpful. But again, it's not even available as a prescription yet. So that is like such a complicating factor.
Yeah, it strikes me also that some of the people who are encountering, some of the people in palliative care wards, not just staff, but the patients themselves, are not necessarily psychedelic apostles, or, they can't necessarily be as easily written off as enthusiastic supporters of psychedelics in other domains. That these are not all, but some of them are, look like more average Joe sort of citizens, or perhaps they're even elderly people who had a different experience with psychedelics in their lives. And I think it's just a really interesting, fertile area for opening up these conversations. I think we've seen the word palliative was only coined in 1987. Palliative care units are, for at least from my perspective as a historian, they're relatively new. And yet I think they've really to focus the conversation around dignity in dying and dignity in death. And I think we see some real political momentum and capital there that also is more of an ally to psychedelics than a necessary constituent. And I guess maybe I'm overly optimistic, but I think that I think that part of what the psychedelic world needs to do, in my humble opinion, is to reach out and seek these kinds of bridges and these alliances, because I think that there's a risk that we can just convince ourselves that psychedelics are good and that it won't actually break through the psychedelic bubble, if you will, to convince regulators that, in fact, there is real merit here. There's still a sense that even just saying LSD, I gave a presentation last week to a group of retired physicians, and these are people with medical training and who've spent their careers doing medical education and medical work, clinical work. And they're like, oh, but LSD, that's the one that makes your brain, that fries your brain, right?
And all that chromosomal damage, yeah.
Yeah.
For sure.
I mean, these were disproven studies in the 70s. And yet it's very interesting that characterization is so strong. But I wonder if I'm curious about the sort of pockets of interest and pockets of support that we might find in sort of adjacent areas. And I think palliative care is one of those places. Anyway, that's where I'll put my money as a historian, at least.
I think you're spot on. And that's a super safe bet. Like, I know that there are for-profit companies looking at setting up sites in countries where the law might be a little more flexible. Yeah. And one pipe dream I have is, I don't know if you've heard of these folks. They're pretty wild. The Seasteading Institute.
I don't know. No.
Oh man. So this is like just like a weird anarcho-libertarian thing where they just set up a little barge in international waters and call it their own country.
Okay.
So like say for example, you set this up off the coast of New York, right? Like 100 miles out.
Yeah.
You could theoretically have these psychedelic treatments now available to a huge city, which is pretty incredible to me. So like these things are low-hanging fruits, and it's like safe and really available, I guess. Safe enough for these people in this particular situation, because it's not really likely they're going back to a career in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Like the risk profile seems lower.
Absolutely. And it raises interesting questions, I think, that again harken back to the history of psychedelics, which is that one of the concerns was that psychedelics were relatively elite, that these were kind of in the domain of, white middle class and upper class college students, for one, but even the researchers themselves were, a kind of an elite bunch. And part of the concern was that they didn't even want to share them with people outside of those circles. And I know, Aldous Huxley becomes a bit of a poster person for this, or people certainly levy that criticism at him that he was an elitist. And I think part of that is true, and I think part of it is unwarranted. It is interesting to see, and again, because I came into this interested in, what does a so-called socialist government want to do with psychedelics? I was interested in the relationship between, access to healthcare in a universal sense. I come from that perspective, and so I'm reflecting on it from that viewpoint. I do think there's a risk of maintaining psychedelics as an elite as something that only elites can access, or something that you have to pay to access, or something, that it makes it more challenging. And I think there's a risk in doing that. And maybe this is just my own political stripes coming through. But I do think there is a risk of repeating that, what I think is a mistake, in closing it off to only certain perspectives, because I think it creates more antagonism, and I think it runs the risk of not being accepted more broadly. And it's not to say that everyone wants to take psychedelics, but I think there has to be some broader momentum and broader consensus that it's okay for people to take psychedelics.
How do you? Yeah, totally. I really agree. Right? It's like, if only the elites are doing yoga, they're like only
Yeah.
them and their friends are going to get those benefits, and it's going to be like politically divisive. And yeah, totally. Like, I think there's a lot of fear around psychedelics, just building this gap. It's kind of like economic, like social gap
Absolutely.
further that we're seeing right now. So like Bezos and his friends just get richer and more powerful, and everybody else gets left behind. Yeah, it's a really hard thing. I'm hopeful that mushrooms will kind of save the day there, and that kind of underground facilitation will also play a big role. But it's like, there's also a lot of risks there too. Like, how do you like find the quality facilitator and make sure you're not going to get hurt? All that's a big deal.
I know this might be overly cute, but I'm a proponent of like, just say no, just say KNOW.
Mm.
And thinking about investing in knowledge networks and I don't have like an answer to how to do that. But exactly what you're saying, there's so much activity that's been going on in a sort of underground sense. And I gather, and I mean, a lot of people don't want to go on record, and I certainly don't want to out anyone who doesn't want to be outed. But many of the underground networks, at least some of the conversations I've had with people, these are very knowledgeable, thoughtful, careful people. And now I don't want to say that as across the board. I don't know. It's hard to survey underground networks. And so we get the one, you only get buy-in from people who are willing to talk to you. So it's really challenging, I think, to try to figure out how to best manage that knowledge and to protect that knowledge, but also to provide safe spaces so that, my aging mother could have access to psychedelics without having to feel like she has to, find a drug dealer. Even that language suggests, something inaccessible. And I think we talk so openly with kids and in schools today about all sorts of pharmaceutical products, like it's commonplace. And yet there's still some drugs that we hold across the line and we don't talk openly about them. And I think that's got to change. I mean, maybe that's just a classic harm reduction model anyway. But these lines between acceptable products that we are all expected to have in our medicine cabinets, and they've really only been around for the last 70 years and for most of them, and those drugs that we see on the other side that we're not allowed to talk about, I mean, I think that's just a misinformation. And I think we need to challenge that knowledge network broadly.
Right. And I love how you frame that. That's like a big portion of what we do here is just try to make community, try to allow opportunities for people to interact and learn from each other. And it's been really interesting. Some of it obviously mediated by money, but we definitely help a lot of folks and do plenty for free. And I just hope that people can kind of balance that. Like, how can we give back and enable, while playing a part in this movement? Yeah, it's an interesting balance. Everybody's going to have a different thing they land on. But it would be good to see like more conferences. I don't know if conferences are the right thing. Like maybe more unconferences just to like spark more conversation, and connection.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine conferences these days I don't know, I assume you're sitting in your home. I'm sitting in my home,
Yeah.
Travel's prohibited. But yeah, it is an interesting moment to reflect and perhaps to take that moment. I know there's so many other pressures and things going on that make it really difficult, I find, to concentrate on anything these days. But it also, perhaps affords us a moment of reflection.
Right. Absolutely. It's, like, what do we really want? Like, what are our goals here? Like, it's, there's a lot of people playing a part, from academics and historians like yourself to like scientists to, therapists. And like, do we do we just kind of want to keep doing the same conference thing we've been doing? It's pretty great. It's really educational. But perhaps like instead of, I don't know, some sort of hero worship or like the person being on stage, maybe it's better to have workshops with like, you know, a dream workshop for me would be like you, Mike J, and like a few other historians, you know, for a weekend, just kind of like running through psychedelic history in a conversational way. I think that would be amazing.
I think it would be great. I mean, I love that idea, of course, but I'd like to maybe challenge you a little bit.
Sure.
I think we need to start opening up the conversation a little bit and maybe thinking about some of the edges of our movement, if you will call it that. I'm not sure, but I feel like we should talk to people who aren't on board, and we should start, you know, thinking about how we want to talk about these things and trying to look for, as I said before, sort of allies. I don't know. I'm curious about this because I feel like we need to take that. We need to take that step. I don't know. Maybe this is really hokey, but again, as a historian, I keep thinking about some of the people who in the past were really, some of them were important players and some of them were kind of like mediumly important players, if you will, like organizers of psychedelic meetings or safe houses for doing psychedelics in a quasi-legal way. Some of these people are still alive, and some of them went on to have really important careers in the drug regulation world or in politics or in healthcare bureaucracy. And I think, I mean, my personal little fantasy would be to reach out to some of the people who haven't openly identified as psychedelic supporters, but who have knowledge of this world from a different perspective, you know, maybe from a bureaucratic perspective. I feel like it's time to start moving the conversation forward and thinking about, you know, how would an HMO cover, now I'll stop because I'm a Canadian speaking about American stuff. I'll go with my Canadian footing.
It's a valid question.
Like, how would Canadian healthcare pay for psychedelics? Would we do that I think we should have a pharmacare program like many other countries have pharmacare programs, but that might be too far to imagine right now. How would we cover this? Who would be covered? Under what circumstances? And start thinking about like rolling up our sleeves, but getting buy-in from people inside the psychedelic community who aren't questioning whether psychedelics are good or bad, but like, okay, let's just say they're good. How would that look? But we'd have to probably talk with people who are going to be a bit more critical of the efficacy, and we'd have to have those conversations first. I don't know. That's my view, is that I think we should be ready to have those conversations. The psychedelic conferences are super awesome. They're really fun and they're lovely. I think we need to talk to people who are critical of us.
Yeah, you know, that's a great point. We're in an echo chamber. There's a lot of arguments about minutia in the echo chamber, but, you know, we should be having more important arguments. Maybe that's why I love Carl Hart so much, is he's like challenging everybody. Chair of psychology at Columbia, right? Like, that's amazing. But who else is like having, I think a lot of people are really timid in psychedelia and they don't want that. They don't want to like raise a profile, even though it might be really helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that is sort of, we're shrouded in this dark history. And, you know, part of, I'm not going to do clinical trials. That would be completely illegal and unethical. But I do feel like a role that I and my fellow historians and other social scientists can play is by helping to challenge that perception of the psychedelic history, because it is a particular version of the history that plays upon certain things. Some of them are true. The CIA did fund experiments. Some of them were grossly unethical. People did have damage, not chromosomal damage, but there were problems that came about. But I think rather than either hiding from that history and pretending it didn't happen, or claiming that today we're on a better footing because we have new technology or new approaches, I think we can confront that history in a sort of classic psychedelic way. You know, we need to confront these pasts. And I think that working together, there's some amazing scholars doing really incredible work on this now that I think are helping to complicate these stories and show that actually that story that resonated and ricocheted through the newspapers, for example, only really hangs on one particular piece. And there are all these other elements that I think we need to take into account. And if we compare that, especially I think, if we compare that with the sort of parallel history of the rise of other pharmaceuticals, I think we'll see that psychedelics actually deserve a place at the table.
Mm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And yeah, if we want to even just bring it back to history, which I think is pretty important to know about and for people to keep working on, like the psychedelic origins are not just, the Amazon or Greece or wherever. Like there's so many different avenues and so many different angles to look at. And not to mention just the, post LSD psychedelic history is extraordinarily big and interesting and could help us understand like maybe what went wrong, what went right, and how we can inform our decisions going forward. I don't know if you've done much. You probably have because you're a historian, but like the history of social movements and like how things can be more effective or less effective. I think we can learn a lot from the past there about how to be more skillful.
Absolutely. I hope this is okay as a bit of a shameless plug, but I've been working with the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, and we're hosting a series on the history of women in psychedelics. And we've only just started posting the material now. We'll post something every week. But it's really incredible hearing from a variety of different people, scholars, students, people who have firsthand experience working with a variety of different ways of thinking about psychedelics. So whether it's midwives or a historian looking at midwives who used ergot to produce abortions, which has kind of a psychedelic angle to it. Also, this connects in with Graf's work, but also looking at different ways that people used to conceal this knowledge for good reason, and opening up those conversations and allowing that information to come to the surface, I think is really important. And it's been really inspiring collecting these. I hope that readers will have a chance to take a look at them at some point, but we just having the opportunity to read them in the first place has really inspired me to think broadly and to look broadly for these sort of stories.
Mm. Yeah. All right. Well, Eric, we're at a little over an hour here. I'm wondering if there's anything else you might want to bring up that we might have missed.
I've been studying psychedelics for 20 years. I can talk about psychedelics all day. So no, I think I'm sure I'll think of something else to say. No, thank you so much for giving me some space to talk here. And I hope it's of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have a website that people can check out your work or where your work is on Chacruna?
I do. Off the top of my head, do I have those details? Probably not.
Send it over and we'll put it in the show notes.
Sure, I can do that.
All right, great. Erika Dyck, historian and professor at University of Saskatchewan. Thank you for joining us. I really hope we get to connect again.
Thanks, Joe. It's wonderful to connect with you, if only virtually.
And there you have it. I hope you liked that episode. I really hope Erika will come back on. And perhaps, I'm really always interested in developing online psychedelic history classes. So maybe we can partner on that. So stay tuned. No promises, but I would love for that to happen. And yeah. So thank you, Erika. Thank you all for listening. If you liked it, please share it with a friend. Maybe write us a review on Facebook or iTunes. Always helpful. Or whatever podcast app you're using, Spotify or whatnot. And yeah, I think that's it for episode recap and help. Again, we have 2 different editions of Navigating Psychedelics for Clinicians and Therapists kicking up in January. If you want to learn more, come over to psychedeliceducationcenter.com and you can dig in, see if it's for you. And we're always happy to answer questions. You can email us at psychedelicstodayemail@gmail.com. So hope y'all are having a beautiful day, and we'll see you on the next episode in a few days. Take care, everybody. Joe Moore signing off. Bye-bye.